Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're now here for the second day of the conference. We have a few more panels. We've been trying to make sure that each panel deals with a slightly different theme, so hopefully today will be a bit different from yesterday. We're going to start with Dr. Ken Mondschein. We'll be speaking with quite an elaborate setup. Excellent. Thanks, Steve.
So I'm Ken Mondschein. For those of you who don't know me, I am the man who sold the world. Of course, I'm both an academic and also I'm a fencing teacher, both modern and historical fencing. And I'd really like to begin this lecture by acknowledging my sponsors. I'm what Americans call an adjunct professor, which means that I get paid by the class, I don't get travel funds or anything like that. So my trip, this European tour, both to here and also to be presenting on the Paris manuscript of Fiore at the Renaissance Society in Berlin in 2 weeks, and also my continued research were underwritten by actually crowdsourced. I actually crowdsourced it. And some people made some very generous donations so that I could be here today. So I'm both videoing this and YouTubing it for them, and also, of course, for the larger HEMA community, because, of course, my research and what I do, I think, doesn't belong to me or really belong to any one person, but it's really to everybody. So I like to make it as public as possible. I also like to thank Alex for putting me up for these past 2 days. Thanks a lot. Anyway, so now on to our show. Now, that was the word from our sponsors, right? So, I don't think anyone would disagree with me that modern science works. I mean, we live in a scientific world. Science has given us things like mobile phones. Science has enabled us to land probes on comets. Science has given us things like microwave curry dinners, and more relevantly for what we do as historians, science has enabled us to, or enabled the West to conquer 85% of the Earth's surface. This is colonialism before World War I. Don't forget also South America was colonized by the Spanish and the Portuguese. After the discovery of agriculture, the scientific revolution was perhaps the biggest thing to happen to humanity. But really, where did it come from? Before there's a discovery, before there's an innovation, let's take the internet, for example, right? The internet has brought us all together. Before there's the internet, there has to be a mentality, a perceived need. How can I argue with complete strangers about historical sword fighting and look at pictures of cats? So the scientific revolution, I'm going to put this back, right? So the question is then, where did the scientific revolution come from, right? Where did the scientific revolution, which for a large part, it's really the application of numerization, right, of mathematics, to the natural world. As Galileo said, if God wrote the book of the universe, the language he wrote it in was mathematics. Where did this mentality come from? And can we see any traces of this in other things that people were concerned with at the time, like fencing books? So first, a bit of clarification first. What exactly do I mean by science? What do I mean by science, and why should we care what fencing books have to say about it? Well, I'll answer the second question first. Cultural institutions such as universities and museums need to be paid for. And in that, they're expected to justify their existences. In the US, universities are increasingly run by corporations, and in England, I don't know if it's the same in Scotland, the government, taking its cue from Henry VIII, sends its visitors about to basically ask people to justify their existence. And if something doesn't balance out on the Excel spreadsheet, it's axed. Historians, we don't generate wealth, right? We don't generate wealth, we don't wield power. If we are going to continue to practice our profession, which of course is valueless in its own sake, right? But if we're going to continue to practice our profession, we have to produce histories that are useful to those who are in power, those who do have money. So if we want the study of historical fencing treatises in the larger sense to become part of mainstream academia, to become something that is valued in its own right, to become a quote-unquote real area of study, then we need to answer bigger disciplinary questions like, how did modernity come to be, including the scientific revolution? Or gender bias in Talhofer's judicial duels, or why isn't the woman in the hall? Thanks for that last one, John. Of course, I've long been interested in the history of science, which is a fascinating subject. And if I'm going to personally pull the thread to unravel the Academy's indifference to HEMA studies, and in the US, I usually guess, oh, do you go to Renaissance fairs? I want to pull at that thread. So, what is science? Science is simply the systematic investigation of and attempt to understand the natural world. It's a mentality and not a result. And Stephen Shapin of Harvard, who's a very great historian of science, has looked at this understanding not in positivist terms, that is, the right answer was there all along, just waiting for someone to have the flash of insight and genius to realize it, but rather that doing science is a variety of practices that have come about for their own reasons, including politics, philosophy, and religion. And of course also hitting people with swords, which of course was a concern of the ruling class of the early modern period, was one of these reasons. So what's the mentality, what's the relation between theorizing and thrusting? And some would argue not much. Here, of course, is from Lucini in 1626. Joachim Koch in 1619 quoted Salvador Fabris, as having said that he had never proceeded nor been zealous to learn to draw round and angled lines, and he would readily admit to a clerk, bachelor, and mathematician that they could do and perform better than he could, as his fencing was not performed on paper or a blackboard with inks and chalks, but in the area and on the square with weapon and sword. And even if he or his scholars might dominate and overcome some with the demonstration of the lines and angles, he still held the opinion that it would not be so easy to defeat someone in the square or in the arena or to obtain the advantage. Thanks to Rainer van Noort for both the cite and the translation. Koch and Fabris and numerous other people were not alone in this. There are ample examples of authors mocking the mathematical and geometrical pretensions that are still often found in fencing books. And of course, Lucini being the most amusing of that. Quevedo is another example. In Vida del Buscón, right? He basically mocks the diestros. He mocks the Spanish school. Because one could argue that mathematical conceptions, geometrical conceptions, attempts to theorize the natural world in fencing books are about as useful as nipples on a breastplate. If you already know how to fence, they tell you what you already know. If you don't, they're incomprehensible. It's really difficult to learn fencing from a book, and the people who were the audience for these books already knew something of fencing. What masters are doing, especially in these early modern treatises, is that they are explaining perhaps their take on it, their way of doing things. And I know that Professor Nanglo and I have been kind of back and forth in some ways about what these are for. He wrote about them in Martial Arts of Renaissance Europe, and I wrote some things, and things have been back and forth. And now it seems like I'm completely turning around from what I had earlier maintained. But if you bear with me, I actually have a point to this. The question is then, if these diagrams are of questionable use, why are they there? Well, why write a book on fencing at all? And the short answer is, same thing as why write history, why do history? It's market forces. People wanted to see them. And this brings us to something called the Thistle Thesis, which the American scholar Pam Long, who's also a very great historian of science, recently won the MacArthur Prize. And she recently revived this in her book, Artist Practitioners and the Rise of the New Sciences. And this is basically the idea that the scientific revolution was enabled by the contact, the convection, the fusion, if you would, between theoretically trained aristocrats with a background in logic and mathematics and other theoretical sciences, and practically skilled artisans. So here's just two examples. Here's Galileo and Hooke, right, from the Micrographia. If Galileo and Hooke hadn't known both some excellent lens grinders and also some, had access to money, we wouldn't either have Jupiter's moons or the Micrographia. The steam engine was indebted to Boyle, who is in turn indebted to von Guericke, who had the theoretical training to theorize on the existence or non-existence of a vacuum, but also had some really excellent German craftsmen to make his Magdeburg spheres, which proved that he evacuated the air from them, and teams of strong horses couldn't pull them apart because of atmospheric pressure. Camillo Agrippa's numerous practical and theoretical works, some generations earlier than that, in addition to his fencing book, needn't be mentioned, and both Pam Long and Evelyn Lincoln from Brown are working on his achievements. So fencing books were an article of interest and consumption for what used to be called the better classes, and represented a sphere of endeavor that attracted non-aristocratic men who wished to better themselves, because being a fencing master is ultimately a blue-collar profession. It's ultimately, it's ultimately something the working class does. So how did these ideas affect fencing books? Well, obviously, at least some of these masters incorporated ideas that would please their patrons. And early modern Europe was in love with the idea of number. But of course, there was some misplaced enthusiasm for what could be explained by number. This is Flute. He's one of the last people to maintain what Peter Gay's called the Augustinian, or Stephen Chapin, the animistic view of the world. This is sort of like the last attenuated instance of sort of, the medieval worldview, but also as seen through the lens of Renaissance humanism. This idea that the microcosm and the macrocosm are linked, that humanity is the reflection of the macrocosm, and we'll see this actually in a quote from Tebow I'll give you in a little bit. But this is, thought to be the true workings of the universe, and this is, and this used to be seen as sort of an obstacle before. This is sort of the misplaced view of the universe. This is wrong. It's not like this. And that Newton came along and got it all right. Until of course Einstein came along and said, well, Newton's mostly right, but it got kind of misplaced. But my argument here is that no matter what their paradigm, right? Kuhn talks about the paradigm shift, right? There was a paradigm shift between this sort of animistic view, this sort of as above, so below view, right? To quote Hermes Trismegistus, right? And Newton. But nonetheless, the seeds of what came later, what came later was indebted to what came before. I might even say that it contained an embryo, but that without that idea, it could not have come later. So, what was the medieval worldview? And can we find it in early fencing literature? Well, yes, we can, of course. And I'm sorry, I thought I faded the background image a bit more, but what I'm quoting there, of course, is physics and also G&M 3227A, the sometimes so-called Dolbringer Fett book, which is actually, he wasn't the author. There's a text by Dolbringer in it, but the actual composer of that house book is anonymous. But of course, this dates from the late 14th century, and of course, it's most famous as the first recording of the Liechtenauer School of Fencing. But if you look at the manuscript context of 3277A, which unfortunately not many people do, it also contains alchemic recipes for hardening steel and other techniques. And besides, of course, this theorization of movement, of all movement, into the Aristotelian commonplace that movement is the number of motion in respect to the before and after. So, of course, translate that into German using the idea of vor and nach. The Italians look at tempo as this measure is a period of time, which can be greater or lesser. It depends on moving objects. The Germans look at the other side of the Aristotelian equation. They say vor and nach, but really they're talking about the same phenomena, the same physical phenomena, and they're both using Aristotle to envision it. But if you assume everyone knows about Aristotle, but what's not as obvious is, I think, the context of 3277A. It's the using Aristotle to describe fencing is the same as using alchemy to harden steel. That by gaining knowledge, by getting the secret knowledge, by theorizing the world, and don't forget alchemy, I mean, chemistry originated with alchemy, but by knowing the principles and knowing the techniques by which one you could do these things, you gain power over the natural world, right? You are making your will manifest. Francis Yates called man the operator. So key, of course, to fencing well, to imposing your will over others in the fencing arena, is understanding the Aristotelian conception of movement. Now, the first idea, obviously, I work more on the Italian stuff than on the German stuff, but and of course, it's the Italian school that was the factional one when the scientific revolution was beginning to take off, and we really see many more scientific notions in the 16th century Italian books and going forwards. But we can find the earliest mention of the idea of tempo in the Italian tradition, in the Paris Fiore. In 14 verse, right? He basically says it's the crossing, it's play at medium distance, that if you're crossed, and then he makes a coupe to the arm. He says this is a short tempo, basically. He uses the Latin tempus. So this is just sort of a brief mention. Where it's really picked up on is by Filippo Vadi. Vadi, of course, here's his signal. He says, I'm a sexton, right? A pair of dividers that can, whoopsie, I didn't want that. I'm a sexton that can divide, O fencer, heed my reasoning. In the same way, you should measure the time. This idea of measurement, this idea of measuring physical phenomena in order to fence. That fencing is, in a sense, a sort of observational science. In the same way, he says, it talks about this theoretically. Geometry divides and separates with infinite numbers. Why are you doing this? Geometry divides and separates with infinite numbers and measures, that fills its pages with knowledge, disorders under its purview, since it is useful to measure blows and steps in order to make the science more secure. Fencing is born from geometry. And he also talks about music, of course. Why? Because mathematics is the study of number. Geometry is the study of number in space. Music is number in time. And of course, astronomy is number in space and time. And of course, fencing is also number in space in time. We can understand this better, I think, if we look at the context Vadi is writing in. Because he's writing, he was at Borsa d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, but the Vadi manuscript that we know of is dedicated to Guidobaldo da Monteferrato, Duke of Urbino, in the 1480s, which of course is the same milieu where Castiglione is writing his book of the Courtier, but it's also one place where this fellow, Luca Pacioli, wrote, the father of modern accounting, who worked at the court of Urbino. And I'll just very quickly, Keith has shown me the 5-minute sign, so I'm going to start paraphrasing my lecture. What he's doing here is he's looking at this geometrical figure. It's pendant down from above. People have actually measured this, but let's think of this as a Platonic form, okay? This is a Platonic idea, right? And of course, we have here another Platonic solid. So we have theoretical ideas. He's looking at, engaging with his eyes and his mind, while he has one hand on the knowledge of the past, and he's performing, he's operating a circle with a triangle in it, that is the Trinity, God and Trinity. So he's making manifest God's plan for the universe, right? God's writing the plan for the universe in number there. And there, of course, over his left shoulder is this noble patron. You always have to have someone, paying the grants. And then, of course, on the table in front of him are a number of measuring tools, right? He's got that sextant, right? He's got that pair of dividers, and of course, a protractor for measuring, making sure the back foot is always at 135 degrees. And we can see this also. Next slide is simply, I'm showing you here, this is Michelangelo's plan for St. Peter's, which of course is on the Vitruvian plan. This idea, just as we saw a flood, as above, so below, the idea of the plan for the perfect temple should be based on proportions of humanity. I'm not getting off Da Vinci Code here. This is actually well established in art history. We see the same thing, of course, with Camillo Agrippa's treatise on the side of science of arms. Agrippa, right, as I said just before, Agrippa is showing, why does he have this astronomical treatise in his book? Well, because he's showing that he can talk reasonably about fencing, even though he's not a professional fencing person, because he has mastery of number in space and time. And he stands, as Lincoln has pointed out, in this tradition of Milanese theorist practitioners. His brother Giorgio was an artilleryman. This is the time, of course, when Tartaglia is coming up with his work on impetus, looking at the velocities of the trajectory of cannonballs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so he's got a number of things going on in his treatise. If you're interested, you can always read my introduction to the translation. But what he's essentially saying is that the human body, let's look at let's look at a few things, that the human body is mathematically, subject to mathematical analysis, that it's subject to the same things as the stars and the numbers and everything else. He makes use of things like the science of perspective, right here, showing how to get out of the way. And he's also taking issue with the arguments of the past, that even though he says he's studied the things of the past, here he is, right, he's arguing with these philosophers armed only with their own books, but here he has, of course, the dividers and the armillary sphere, the means for making deductions for himself, and he's arguing from reason and authority. Of course, he has the world under his feet and the sword at his belt. So, Carranza's Destreza follows the same sort of thing. I'll let Professor Valle talk about Destreza. But of course, they do this in a very different way, because the Spanish at the time were very, very conservative. And they're they're not revolutionary. They're not trying to overthrow the world. So he's rooting himself actually as a conservative. Tebow, of course, does the same thing. And Tebow, I think, is most interesting because he's like Flood. He's taking that macrocosm and microcosm to its furthest extreme. And here, actually, in his introduction, I've got the translation here, he explicitly says this, that humanity is the microcosm, and he also uses, as Agrippa implied, he uses Pythagoreanism to explain this. We could see the same thing reflected. This is contemporary, and this is Tebow's milieu. This is the anatomy theater at Leyden, right? Here's humanity. In the midst of the circle of the universe, there's the dividers, all the creations around it, fit subject for geometrical study. And finally, to tie it in, if I had more time, I would talk more in depth about this. It's tied in, finally, with the Scott collection. Here's Ghisliero. The Scott collection has some marvelous illustrations. One of the few illustrated copies of Ghisliero, who starts also from this same basis, moves, talks about perspective, geometry, and mathematical analysis of the body. Even non writers who position themselves as non-scientists, such as Pharaoh, even Pharaoh appeals to his audience by including this geometrical diagram. And finally, just to bring it all home, I promise, Keith, I told you I wouldn't run over time. What I want to bring it home to is, of course, Descartes. And Descartes wrote, we know Descartes wrote a fencing book. We know this because Adrien Bellet, his literary executor and the guy who wrote his biography, said he did. And people have often said, oh, Besnard was his master, because they're both from Rennes, even though Besnard was later. But my feeling is that Descartes, considering that he spent a lot of time in the Netherlands and was pretty much contemporary with Tebow, the fencing book he wrote was probably a lot more Tebow-like than later works by Besnard, which are basically early small sword works, and that it really gives us the fascinating possibility that the Cartesian coordinate system and the Cartesian analytic geometry was inspired, at least in part, by this fencing analysis of movement and motion. And with that, I'm going to conclude my paper, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions about that?
Oh yeah, I'll say it.
Another question, if you would. It needs a little bit of setup. Currently, in building museum exhibitions, one of the things they do is they try to get a great deal of technology involved in it. And often that's a great thing, and often it's extraneous, in fact. But it goes both ways. And there are some things that are great geometry in there, and some things like the signal that's on the side of the Agrippa you're looking at before serve no purpose except to say, hey, here's technology. You want technology, here's something. I don't know.
Agrippa, if you read Agrippa, Agrippa is deploying, there's a reason why that's all there. He's deploying it as metaphor. He's making a statement with it. But it's more of a social statement, I think, and a statement about authority and knowledge than really doing theoretical science in the way we think about it. In other words, he's being sciencey, okay? He's being sciencey in a way. But why is he being sciencey? Because this is what people wanted. This is what people expected. And Agrippa was read, and we find copies of Agrippa, all through Europe. He was read, and people liked this stuff. Even if they couldn't read Italian, they're like, look, geometry and fencing.
I just really wanted to differentiate between those things which actually demonstrate something mathematically like the view, the vision, the movement, and then the bits which are just kind of little shapes that are off on the side.
Oh, those things?
Yeah.
Oh no, there's a reason for that. I didn't get a chance to talk about that. But that stick there? It basically says the human body is a fit mechanism to do all the fencing things, just as you can use a stick as a pair of dividers to make all these shapes. And okay, Professor Angela.
Just a couple of comments I want to make. You know, of course, I fundamentally disagree with you.
Yeah. Yes. I shall await your seconds.
I can't help feeling that the scientific demonstrations that we have in some, not all academic books, but some academic books, are more for show than for doing. And I feel like even about the Agrippa, there's all this, you're absolutely right, of course, there's a huge amount of mathematical potential there. Where I disagree is I don't think in the end it comes out in this fencing, which is much more pragmatic.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm uneasy about that. And I think, of course, most fencing books, if you look back through the history of fencing books, right through to the 19th to the 20th century, they're much more obviously pragmatic. And one of the things that I was reminded of when you were speaking is, of course, what you say much of it is true, over the general overarching idea about the importance of scientific experimentation. But I'm a little bit reminded of Glenn Gould's millipede. You know Glenn Gould's millipede?
No, I'm afraid I don't.
Glenn Gould postulated that one day you asked the millipede which leg he moved first.
Mm-hmm.
And because he couldn't walk anymore, because he couldn't think which leg he moved first. It was too much more formula. Because he didn't work like that, he just worked pragmatically. And so I'm a bit uneasy about this theory, although of course it's extremely interesting, and you can certainly demonstrate an interest in mathematics and in the cosmological and also the anthropomorphic diagrams of say, like Tebow and so on, of course the Spanish school. How far it's related to actual combat, I think in another matter.
Well, if I can take a moment to reply, two things. One is that I think I'm coming around to your way of thinking in the long run, not sort of indirectly, simply because, these are things that people do learn fencing pragmatically. It's something you have to do sword in hand, ideally from somebody who already knows what they're doing and can demonstrate the sensibility to you. Just like it's hard to play, Gershwin if you just have the sheet music and you can't, and you've never heard Rhapsody in Blue. And I think that, in a large part, these mathematical figures are there to be are there to delight the reader, just in the same way that these very sanguineous, rapers of the eye are there to delight the reader. That they're completely inutile, I'm not sure if I entirely agree with that, because I think that let's suppose I'm a 16th century fencing master, and I want to appeal to a clientele. I already know how to fence, I already know how to teach fencing, but I can read these sorts of new ideas, perhaps, in Capo Pharaoh and Fabris, and because I understand how this would work, having already had the practical experience, then I can perhaps gain some useful knowledge from these. But it's really the sort of thing that needs to be, undertaken sword in hand. And obviously, if I hadn't had that sense of tempo, it's just like Professor McGowan. It's just like dancing. That you have to feel the rhythm, otherwise you're not dancing very well. It's the same thing with fencing. It's a sense of timing and a sense of distance, and that can only really be gotten through practical experience. We see this actually very often in historical martial arts groups, that people are sort of doing things as a choreography or by rote, and then it doesn't really work as well when they're actually trying to fence, because they learned it in different circumstances from which one actually fences. So Keith is showing me a time up thingy.
So we had a couple of long questions and long answers there. If you have any more questions, lunch might be a good opportunity.
Yeah. I'm stopping my camera.